Choose your mate, or we'll decide for you, the pack warned. Then the Alpha King did the unthinkable. The horn rang 3 times across the valley, and every wolf in Ashford territory froze where they stood. Elena Voss dropped the basket of herbs she was carrying and looked up at the sky, her heart suddenly pounding. 3 horn blasts meant only one thing. A council assembly had been called, and no one was allowed to stay home. She ran through the trees toward the meeting hall, her bare feet slapping against damp earth, her breath coming fast. Around her, other wolves were doing the same, abandoning chores and errands, rushing toward the center of the settlement, where the great stone hall stood waiting. Something was wrong. The horn had not sounded like this in years. When Elena reached the hall, it was already packed. Hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder, murmuring, glancing nervously at one another. She pushed her way toward the front, close enough to see the raised platform where the Elder Council sat in a row of carved wooden chairs. At the center of the platform stood Alpha King Damon Ashford, tall and still, his dark eyes scanning the crowd like he was searching for someone in particular. Elena had seen him from a distance many times, but never this close. He looked younger than the stories made him sound, but there was something in his face that made her stomach tighten. He looked like a man carrying a weight no one else could see. The eldest councilman, a gray-haired wolf named Edgar Thorne, stepped forward and raised his hand for silence. The murmuring died instantly. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Wolves of Ashford," Edgar began, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "For too long, our pack has weakened from within. Too many of you remain unmated, unattached, and unwilling to secure the future of this territory. Our numbers fall, our bloodlines thin. Rival packs grow bold because they sense our weakness." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Elena felt it too, a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with fear of enemies, and everything to do with a decree she could already sense coming. "Therefore," Edgar continued, "the council has reached a decision. Every unmated wolf above the age of 25 has 30 days to choose a mate. Choose freely, choose wisely, but choose. If you fail to choose within that time, the council will choose for you." The hall exploded into noise. Wolves shouted questions, some in anger, some in disbelief. Elena stood frozen, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She was 26. She had buried her engagement 2 years ago, when her intended betrayed her trust, and left her standing alone at what should have been a joining ceremony. Since then, she had wanted nothing to do with mates, ceremonies, or choices made under pressure. And now the council wanted to strip even that choice away from her, wrapping it in a countdown like a sentence. Beside her, an older woman gripped her arm. 30 days, the woman whispered. They cannot be serious. But looking at the stone faces of the Elder Council, Elena understood immediately that they were entirely serious. Edgar raised his hand again, quieting the crowd a second time. "This decree applies to every wolf in Ashford territory, without exception," he said, and his eyes flicked, just for a moment, toward the Alpha King standing silently beside him. Damon did not move. His expression did not change. But Elena, watching closely, saw something flicker behind his eyes, something sharp and guarded, gone before anyone else could notice. "Without exception," Edgar repeated, louder this time, as if daring anyone to challenge the words. "That includes our king." A hush fell so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. Every wolf in the hall turned to look at Damon Ashford, waiting for his reaction. He had ruled the pack for 10 years, ever since his father died in a border skirmish, and in all that time, no one had ever forced his hand on anything. He answered to no council, no elder, no law but his own judgment. Yet here he stood, being told, in front of his entire pack, that even he was not above the new decree. Damon's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Then he spoke, his voice low and controlled, carrying an edge that made the hair on Elena's arms rise. "The council may make its decrees," he said, "but no one decides for me. Not now. Not ever." The words hung in the air, defiant and cold. Edgar's face flushed, but he did not argue further, not in front of the pack. Instead, he simply nodded once, a gesture that somehow felt like a warning rather than an agreement. The assembly was dismissed soon after, but the hall did not empty quietly. Wolves clustered in small groups, whispering, arguing, some already speculating about who might choose whom. Elena slipped through the crowd toward the door, wanting nothing more than to disappear into the trees and breathe air that did not smell like fear and gossip. She almost made it outside when a hand caught her elbow. She turned, expecting a friend, but found herself looking up into the face of Marla Voss, her own aunt, and one of the few council members who had not spoken during the assembly. "You heard," Marla said quietly. "I heard," Elena answered. "It doesn't change anything. I'm not choosing anyone. Not for a decree. Not for a deadline." Marla's expression softened with something like pity. "Elena, I know what happened to you. I know why you've closed that door. But this isn't a request. If you don't choose, the council will choose for you, and you will have no say in who that is." "Then I'll take my chances," Elena said, pulling her arm free. "I would rather stand alone forever than be handed to a stranger like a piece of property." She walked away before her aunt could respond, weaving through the crowd until the noise of the hall faded behind her. The forest welcomed her with its familiar quiet, the scent of pine and damp soil calming the storm in her chest. She walked without direction for a long while, replaying the assembly in her mind, the decree, the horrified murmurs, the strange, defiant look on the Alpha King's face. She had expected him to bow to the council's demand instantly, the way he seemed to command every other outcome in the pack. Instead, he had refused, publicly, in front of everyone. It was reckless. It was almost unheard of. And for reasons she could not explain, it stayed with her the rest of the evening, long after she should have stopped thinking about it. That night, Elena sat outside her small cabin at the edge of the settlement, staring up at the stars, trying to calculate how she might survive the next 30 days without losing the only freedom she had left. Around her, the sounds of the pack continued as normal. Distant laughter, the crackle of a cooking fire, a pup crying somewhere before being soothed. Life moved on as if the world had not just been rearranged. She thought of her broken engagement, of the humiliation of standing before the pack in her ceremonial dress while her intended never arrived, of the whispers that followed her for months afterward. She had promised herself she would never again let anyone else decide who she should love, or when, or how. And now the council was threatening to break that promise for her. Far across the settlement, in the great house that overlooked the valley, Damon Ashford stood at his window, watching the same stars Elena watched, though neither of them knew it. His hands rested on the stone sill, gripping until his knuckles paled. The council's decree had been humiliating, a public challenge to his authority, disguised as concern for the pack's future. But worse than the humiliation was the truth beneath it, a truth he had buried for years and refused to speak aloud to anyone. He was not mateless because he had never found the one meant for him. He was mateless because he had found her years ago and had chosen, deliberately, to walk away. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to remember a scent he had spent a decade trying to forget. Wildflowers and rain, a scent that belonged to a woman he had convinced himself he could never claim, because a king who bent to his own heart, he had believed, could never hold a pack together. Now the council had given him 30 days to prove that belief wrong, or lose control of everything he had built. Behind him, a knock sounded at the door. His second in command, a broad-shouldered wolf named Gareth Locke, entered without waiting for permission, his face grim. "The council is already moving," Gareth said. "Edgar has men drawing up lists, names of every unmated wolf in the territory. They mean to have their matches ready before the 30 days are done, whether people choose or not." Damon did not turn from the window. "Let them make their lists. And you? What will you do?" For a long moment, Damon said nothing. Then, quietly, almost too quiet for Gareth to hear, he answered, "I already know who I want. I have known for 10 years. The question is, whether I have the courage to take her before someone else does." Gareth's eyebrows rose, but he did not push further. He had served the Alpha King long enough to know when a door had been left open just a crack, and when pushing too hard would only slam it shut again. He nodded once and left the room, leaving Damon alone with his window, his stars, and the weight of a decision that had been 30 days too long in coming. Elena did not sleep well that night, and she was not alone in that. Across the settlement, wolves lay awake, calculating who they might approach, who might reject them, who they could tolerate, for the rest of their lives, if it meant avoiding the humiliation of a lottery match. Friendships strained under sudden pressure. Families argued over strategic alliances disguised as love. The gentle rhythm of pack life had been shattered in a single evening, replaced by something anxious and sharp. In the morning, Elena rose before dawn, unable to bear the thought of facing curious eyes and whispered questions from her neighbors. She dressed quickly and slipped into the forest, taking the long path toward the river, where she often went to clear her mind. The air was cool and thick with mist, and the only sounds were birds waking in the branches above her and water rushing over smooth stones below. She had not gone far when she caught a scent that made her stop cold. It was faint, carried on the breeze from somewhere upstream, but unmistakably familiar in a way she could not immediately place. She frowned, tilting her head, trying to understand why her instincts suddenly felt so alert, so aware, as if her body recognized something her mind had not yet caught up to. She told herself it was nothing, some trick of the wind, and continued walking. But the feeling lingered the rest of the morning, a small persistent hum beneath her skin that refused to fade, even hours later, when she finally returned home to face whatever chaos the day would bring. She did not know yet that 30 days from that morning, her entire life would be turned upside down in front of the whole pack. She did not know that the scent on the wind belonged to a man who had spent 10 years denying exactly what she had just, without realizing it, begun to sense in return. All she knew was that something had shifted, quietly, invisibly, and there would be no going back to the life she had known before the horn sounded 3 times across the valley. The days that followed moved strangely, both too fast and too slow. Notices went up around the settlement listing the names of every unmated wolf required to comply with the new decree. Elena's name appeared on the 3rd day, printed plainly beside dozens of others, a public record of her private struggle. She hated seeing it there, hated the way people glanced at the list and then at her, as if measuring who she might be forced to accept. Word spread quickly about the confrontation between Edgar and the Alpha King. Some wolves whispered that Damon would defy the council entirely and refuse to choose, daring them to challenge his rule directly. Others insisted he had already selected someone in secret and was simply waiting for the right moment to reveal his choice. Elena paid little attention to the rumors, focused instead on avoiding the growing pressure from her own family to make a decision before the council made one for her. Her aunt visited twice more that week, each time gentler than the last, each time more insistent. "There is a young man from the eastern border," Marla said on her 2nd visit, settling into the chair across from Elena's small table. "Good family, respected. He has expressed interest in meeting you." "I don't want to meet anyone arranged for me," Elena said, not looking up from the herbs she was sorting. "I want to be left alone." "That option is disappearing, Elena. 30 days becomes 23 tomorrow. You cannot wish this decree away." Elena set down her work and finally met her aunt's eyes. "Then let the council choose. I would rather be assigned to a stranger by lottery than pretend affection I do not feel, just to satisfy a deadline." Marla studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her expression. "You may not mean those words as much as you think," she said quietly, and left without further argument. Elena told herself her aunt was wrong. She told herself the same thing every night as the days ticked away, as more names were crossed off the list around the settlement, as couples began forming out of panic rather than genuine feeling. She watched friends she had known her whole life pair off with people they barely knew, choosing safety over uncertainty, choosing anyone over the unknown terror of the lottery. She refused to do the same. Whatever the council decided for her, she would not surrender her heart just to avoid a countdown. Meanwhile, across the settlement, Damon Ashford fought a different battle entirely. Every day, the council pressed him harder, reminding him publicly and privately that his continued refusal to choose only weakened his position further. Rival packs had already caught wind of the internal turmoil within Ashford territory, and scouts reported increased activity along the borders, testing weaknesses, watching for any sign that the pack might fracture from within. Gareth brought him updates each evening, and each evening Damon listened in silence, his mind elsewhere, circling endlessly around the same unresolved question. He had spent 10 years convincing himself that duty mattered more than desire, that a king who allowed himself to want something purely for his own heart risked everything he had built. But watching his pack tear itself apart under the pressure of the new decree, He began to wonder if his years of restraint had done any good at all. On the 12th day, everything changed. Damon had taken to walking the border alone in the evenings, partly to inspect the territory himself, and partly to escape the suffocating tension inside the settlement walls. He moved silently through the trees, senses alert, when a scent stopped him mid-step, exactly as it had stopped Elena days earlier near the river. Wildflowers and rain. He froze, every instinct in his body suddenly sharp and focused. He had told himself for a decade that memory alone could not explain the intensity of that scent, that time would dull it eventually. But standing there in the darkening forest, he realized with startling clarity that the scent was not memory at all. It was real, close, and growing stronger with every breath he took. He followed it without thinking, moving through the trees with a purpose he had denied himself for years. The scent led him toward the river, toward the very path Elena had walked nearly 2 weeks before, and though he did not find her there that night, the certainty settled into his bones, like something inevitable finally arriving home. She was near. She had always been near, somewhere within his own territory, and he had spent 10 years refusing to search for her because he feared what claiming her might cost him. He returned to the great house that night, with a new resolve hardening inside his chest. The council could threaten him, the pack could whisper, rival alphas could circle the borders waiting for weakness, but none of it mattered anymore, compared to the singular truth he could no longer deny. His mate was here. And whatever the cost, he intended to find her before the 30 days ran out, before the council, or fate, or anyone else decided her future without his voice in the matter. The countdown that had once felt like a threat suddenly felt like something else entirely. A deadline, yes, but also, for the first time in 10 years, a chance. Elena, unaware that she had just become the center of her king's quiet obsession, spent that same evening exactly as she had spent every evening since the decree, alone by her fire, refusing to bend to pressure she found unjust. She did not yet know that somewhere beyond the trees, the most powerful wolf in the territory had just caught her scent, and recognized, at last, the one thing he had spent a decade running from. Neither of them could have guessed how quickly the 18 days remaining would collapse into chaos, confrontation, and a choice that would shake the entire pack to its foundation. But for now, under a sky full of quiet stars, both of them simply felt the same unexplainable pull, and neither had any idea it was pulling them toward each other. Elena woke on the 18th day, to the sound of shouting outside her cabin. She threw on her cloak and stepped out to find a crowd gathering near the notice board at the center of the settlement, voices raised in confusion and alarm. Pushing through the gathered wolves, she saw what had caused the commotion. A new notice had been posted overnight, this one bearing the seal of the Alpha King himself, rather than the council. The notice announced that a formal choosing assembly would be held in 12 days, on the final day of the decree, where every unmated wolf who had not already selected a partner would be matched publicly according to council record. Beside the notice hung a second paper, shorter and colder, stating that any match made through the lottery would be considered binding immediately, with no period of courtship or adjustment allowed. Elena stared at the paper, her stomach twisting. 12 days. She had told herself she had more time to figure out some way around the decree, some loophole, some argument the council might accept. Now the timeline had tightened, and the reality of what awaited her felt suddenly, terrifyingly close. Around her, the crowd buzzed with panic. A young man near the front turned pale as he searched for his own name among those still unmatched. An older woman wept quietly, comforted by her daughter, whispering about a match she feared might be announced. Elena backed away from the crowd, her breath coming shallow, and walked quickly toward the tree line, needing space to think. She did not get far before a familiar voice called her name. Elena, wait. She turned to find her childhood friend, a gentle wolf named Peter Langley, jogging to catch up with her. Peter had grown up 2 cabins down from her own, and though there had never been anything romantic between them, they had remained close since childhood, sharing secrets and complaints the way only old friends could. You saw the notice, Peter said, slightly out of breath. I saw it, Elena answered. 12 days, they've moved the deadline forward without even asking anyone. Peter hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening too closely. Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say no. She crossed her arms, already suspicious of where this was headed. Peter, I know we've never thought of each other that way, he continued quickly, but we're friends. We trust each other. If we declared intent together before the assembly, we could avoid the lottery entirely. No strangers, no forced matches. Just us, exactly as we've always been, only official. Elena felt her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Peter was offering her an escape, a safe and painless way out of the terrifying uncertainty hanging over every unmated wolf in the territory. And it would have been so easy to accept, to sign her name beside his, and be done with the whole miserable ordeal. But even as she considered it, something in her resisted, quiet but insistent, a feeling she could not quite explain. She thought of the scent she had caught by the river nearly 2 weeks earlier, faint and strange, and somehow unforgettable, and though she told herself it meant nothing, some part of her refused to let go of it entirely. "Peter," she said gently, "that's the kindest offer anyone has made me since this whole mess began. But I can't say yes. Not because there's anything wrong with you. Because it wouldn't be honest, not for either of us." Peter's shoulders sank slightly, though he nodded with understanding rather than resentment. "I had to ask," he said. "For what it's worth, I hope whatever you're waiting for is worth the risk you're taking by refusing everyone else." She watched him walk away, guilt settling uncomfortably in her chest, wondering if she had just made the worst mistake of her life by turning down the one safe option available to her. Meanwhile, inside the great house overlooking the valley, Damon Ashford paced the length of his study, while Gareth stood near the door, arms folded, watching his king with growing concern. "You moved the deadline forward," Gareth said. "The council will see that as an act of provocation." "The council already sees everything I do as provocation," Damon replied without slowing his pacing. "Better to control the timeline myself than let Edgar dictate every step." "And your own choice? 12 days is not much time to find someone you've spent a decade avoiding." Damon stopped pacing and turned to face his second, his expression unusually open for a man who guarded his thoughts as carefully as his territory. "I am not avoiding her anymore, Gareth. I caught her scent 6 days ago, near the Eastern River. She is close. I intend to find her before the assembly, whatever it costs me." Gareth studied him for a long moment. "And if she has already chosen someone else by the time you find her?" The question landed like a blow, and Damon's jaw tightened visibly. He had not allowed himself to consider that possibility, not seriously, not until Gareth spoke it aloud. The thought of arriving too late, of finding his fated mate, already promised to another wolf through fear or convenience, sent something sharp and possessive twisting through his chest. "Then I will deal with that when I have no other choice," Damon said quietly. "But I refuse to lose her to a decree I never wanted enforced in the first place." Over the following days, Damon threw himself into a search he kept carefully hidden from the rest of the pack. He walked the eastern border each evening, tracing the paths where the scent had been strongest, questioning discreetly among the wolves who lived nearest the river about anyone new or unfamiliar who might have passed through recently. Progress came slowly, frustratingly slowly, each evening ending without success, each morning bringing renewed determination, despite the mounting pressure of the shrinking countdown. Elena, unaware of the search unfolding just beyond her daily routine, spent those same days fending off increasingly desperate proposals from wolves, hoping to avoid the lottery through any arrangement available. A widower twice her age approached her cautiously, offering companionship and stability rather than romance. A young hunter from the northern huts suggested a practical partnership built on friendship rather than feeling. Each time, Elena declined as gently as she could manage, though the refusals grew heavier with every passing day, weighted by the knowledge that her options were narrowing rapidly toward a single terrifying outcome. On the 7th day before the assembly, her aunt visited once more, this time with an urgency that unsettled Elena more than any previous conversation. "The council has finalized its match list," Marla said, seating herself without waiting for an invitation. "Those who remain unchosen by the assembly will be paired according to strategic alliance rather than preference. Elena, I have seen the preliminary list. Your name has been placed alongside a wolf from the Blackthorn pack." Elena's blood ran cold. The Blackthorn pack bordered Ashford territory to the north, led by an alpha named Victor Kane, whose reputation for cruelty and ambition had long unsettled even the Elder Council. A match with anyone from Blackthorn was not merely inconvenient, it was dangerous. They cannot do that, Elena said, her voice rising despite herself. A match with Blackthorn would tie our families together permanently. That's not protection. That's a political trade. It secures peace along a contested border, Marla said carefully, though her own expression betrayed unease. I argued against it, Elena, but the council believes strategic matches strengthen the PAC's position. If you do not choose someone yourself before the assembly, I fear this is the outcome you will face. Elena sat in stunned silence, long after her aunt departed, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. 7 days remained before the choosing assembly, 7 days before she might be bound permanently to a stranger, from a PAC known throughout the territory for its ruthlessness, all because she had refused to compromise her own heart under pressure. She thought again, unbidden, of the strange scent by the river, of the quiet certainty that had settled over her that morning weeks ago. She did not understand it, could not explain it, but as the deadline closed in around her like a tightening fist, she found herself wondering, for the first time, whether ignoring that instinct had been the wrong choice all along. Outside her window, the sky darkened toward evening, and somewhere beyond the trees, unknown to her still, the Alpha King continued his search with a desperation that mirrored her own fear exactly, though neither of them yet understood how close they truly were to finding what they had both, in their own ways, spent years refusing to seek. 6 days before the choosing assembly, Elena decided she could no longer wait passively for fate to decide her future. If the council intended to bind her to a stranger from Blackthorn territory, she needed information, and the only way to gather it safely was to speak with someone who had dealt with the Blackthorn pack directly. She thought immediately of old Councilman Edgar, who had negotiated border agreements with Victor Kane for years, though approaching him meant risking his suspicion about her intentions. She found him instead by accident, near the eastern edge of the settlement, deep in conversation with 2 wolves she did not recognize. Their clothing marked them as outsiders, their bearing proud and watchful, in a way that made Elena's instincts prickle with unease. She slowed her pace, staying half-hidden behind a cluster of trees, straining to catch fragments of the conversation carried on the wind. Alpha Kane grows impatient, one of the strangers said. He expects the match to be honored, regardless of what young Elena Voss might prefer. Elena's stomach dropped. Hearing her own name spoken so casually by strangers from a pack she had never even visited, sent a cold shiver down her spine. She pressed closer to the tree, listening harder. The council has given assurances, Edgar replied, his voice lower than usual, almost apologetic. The match will be finalized at the assembly, if she has not chosen otherwise. Alpha Kane need not worry. See that it is finalized, the stranger said. Our Alpha does not tolerate broken promises, especially not from a pack as unstable as yours currently appears. The threat in those words was unmistakable, and Elena felt anger rising to replace her fear. Her future was being negotiated behind her back, like territory on a map, discussed by strangers who did not know her, did not care about her, and viewed her only as a tool to secure peace along a contested border. She turned and walked away before anyone could notice her presence, her mind racing through options that felt increasingly limited with each passing hour. 6 days remained. 6 days to find some alternative before she became a bargaining chip handed over to a pack known for its brutality. That evening, unable to bear the walls of her cabin any longer, Elena wandered deeper into the forest than she normally allowed herself, following familiar trails that eventually gave way to unfamiliar ones. She told herself she simply needed air, needed distance from the suffocating pressure closing in around her, but some quieter part of her recognized that she was also, without fully admitting it, searching for something she could not name. She reached a small clearing, bathed in the last light of sunset, when a sound behind her made her spin around, every sense suddenly alert. A large gray wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. It took her only a moment to recognize him, even in wolf form. The size, the bearing, the unmistakable dark eyes. Alpha King Damon Ashford stood before her, having clearly followed a trail of his own through the darkening woods. He shifted slowly back into his human form, dressed simply, none of the ceremonial finery she had seen him wearing at the assembly weeks earlier. Standing this close to him for the first time, Elena felt something she could not explain, a pull deep in her chest that made her pulse quicken and her thoughts scatter. "You're the one," Damon said quietly, his voice rough with something like disbelief. "I've been searching for weeks." Elena took an instinctive step back, confusion and wariness mixing with the strange unfamiliar warmth spreading through her. "Searching for what, exactly?" "For you," he said simply, closing the distance between them slowly, giving her space to retreat if she chose, though she found herself, inexplicably, standing her ground instead. "I caught your scent by the river, weeks ago. I have spent every evening since then, trying to trace it back to its source." "That's impossible," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, memory flickered through her mind, of that same morning, the strange scent on the wind, that had stopped her cold, and lingered in her thoughts for days afterward. "I felt something too, by the river. I thought it was nothing." "It was not nothing," Damon said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Elena Voss, I believe you are my fated mate. I have known, in some way for 10 years, though I refused to accept it until recently." The words landed like a physical blow, and Elena stumbled backward, her mind reeling with too many emotions to process at once. Shock, disbelief, and underneath it all, a strange, undeniable recognition that frightened her more than anything the council had threatened her with. 10 years, she repeated numbly. "You've known for 10 years and said nothing? While the entire pack has been searching for mates under threat of a lottery, while I have been fighting off unwanted proposals, while the council was planning to hand me over to Blackthorn territory as a political trade, you knew, and you said nothing?" Damon's expression darkened at the mention of Blackthorn. "They mean to match you with Kane's pack?" "In 6 days, Elena said, her anger returning now, sharper and more focused. "Unless I choose someone else first. So forgive me, if I find it difficult to celebrate a revelation you kept buried for a decade, while my entire future was being decided without my consent." "I understand your anger," Damon said, and something in his voice, quiet and genuinely regretful, softened the edges of her fury, despite herself. "I convinced myself for years that claiming a mate would weaken my position as king. That duty required me to stand alone. I was wrong. I have been wrong for a long time, and I am asking you now, honestly, to give me the chance to make it right." Elena studied him in the fading light, torn between the instinctive pull she could not deny and the very real anger she felt at years of silence that had nearly cost her everything. "And what exactly are you proposing? That I simply forget everything and accept you, here, now, because some instinct tells us we belong together?" "I am proposing nothing tonight," Damon said. "I only wanted you to know the truth before the assembly decides your future, without your voice in the matter. What you choose to do with that truth is entirely yours to decide." They stood together in the clearing, as darkness settled fully around them, neither speaking for a long while, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy in the cool evening air. Elena felt the pull between them growing stronger with every passing minute, an ache she could not fully explain, resistant even to the anger still simmering beneath her surface. 6 days, she finally said. "The assembly is in 6 days. If what you say is true, why not simply announce it now? Why not end the council's plans immediately, instead of leaving me to face the countdown alone?" Damon's expression grew troubled. "Because the council would use it against us both. They would claim I forced my will upon you, that I circumvented their decree through royal privilege, rather than genuine bond. I need proof, Elena. I need you to choose me freely, in front of the pack, so no one can claim otherwise. And if I don't choose you? If I decide the years of silence outweigh whatever bond you believe exists between us, then I will honor your choice," Damon said, though pain flickered visibly across his face at the possibility. "Even if it breaks something in me I cannot fully explain." Elena left the clearing that night with more questions than answers, her mind spinning with the impossible weight of what she had just learned. She walked home slowly, replaying every word Damon had spoken, every strange flicker of recognition that had passed between them, unable to decide whether she had just been given a gift or a burden disguised as fate. Behind her, Damon remained in the clearing long after she disappeared into the trees, staring at the spot where she had stood, feeling for the first time in 10 years something dangerously close to hope, tempered by the terrifying possibility that hope alone might not be enough to undo the damage his silence had already caused. 6 days remained before the assembly would decide, one way or another, whether Ashford Territory's king would finally claim the mate he had denied himself for a decade, or whether pride, fear, and political maneuvering would tear them apart before they ever had the chance to begin. Elena did not sleep at all that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small cabin, replaying the encounter in the clearing, over and over, trying to make sense of feelings that refused to be organized into anything logical. Part of her wanted to dismiss the entire conversation as some trick of instinct, easily explained away by loneliness and fear of the approaching deadline. But another part of her, quieter and more honest, recognized the truth in what Damon had said, recognized it in the way her body had responded simply standing near him, in the way the scent of him lingered even now, hours later, refusing to fade from her memory. By morning, exhaustion had worn her nerves thin, and she found herself unable to focus on even the simplest tasks. She dropped a jar of dried herbs twice while sorting her small pantry, and when a neighbor stopped by to ask about the coming assembly, Elena answered so distractedly that the woman left looking faintly concerned. She was still trying to gather her thoughts when a knock sounded at her door in the early afternoon. She opened it expecting her aunt, or perhaps Peter checking in after their conversation days earlier. Instead, she found Gareth Locke standing on her step, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that immediately put her on guard. "The Alpha King requests your presence," Gareth said, "privately, at the Great House, this evening." Elena's pulse quickened, though she kept her voice steady. "And if I decline?" "Then I will tell him you declined," Gareth said simply. "He gave me no instructions to insist. Only to ask." She studied him for a moment, searching for some sign of judgment or suspicion, but found none. Gareth's face remained unreadable, a soldier delivering a message rather than a man with opinions of his own to share. Finally, she nodded. "Tell him I'll come." Gareth departed without further comment, and Elena spent the remaining hours before evening in a state of restless anticipation she could not fully explain, even to herself. She told herself she was going only to gather more information, to understand exactly what Damon intended before the assembly forced a decision neither of them had chosen freely. But beneath that reasoning lingered something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to name. The great house stood at the highest point of the settlement, overlooking the valley below with an authority that matched its occupant. Elena had never been inside before, and as she climbed the wide stone steps that evening, she felt smaller than she had in years, acutely aware of the weight her decision carried, not just for herself, but for the entire pack watching from the shadows of rumor and speculation. A servant led her through quiet corridors to a study near the back of the house, where Damon waited alone, standing near a window that overlooked the darkening valley. He turned as she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with everything left unresolved from the night before. "Thank you for coming," Damon finally said. "I almost didn't," Elena admitted, stepping further into the room. "I spent most of the day convincing myself this was a mistake. And yet you're here." "Curiosity," she said, though even to her own ears the excuse sounded thin. "You said you needed proof for the council. I want to understand exactly what that means before I agree to anything." Damon gestured toward a pair of chairs near the fireplace, and they sat facing each other, the fire crackling softly between them, casting warm light across features that seemed less guarded than they had in the clearing the night before. "The council will not accept a private declaration between us," Damon explained. "They already suspect I intend to defy the decree through royal authority rather than genuine bond. If I simply announce you as my mate without public confirmation of the connection, Edgar will use it as grounds to challenge my rule entirely, perhaps even to remove me from power." Elena frowned. "Then what exactly do you propose?" "The assembly itself," Damon said. "When the lottery matches are announced, if you have not chosen otherwise, your name will be called alongside the Blackthorn representative. At that moment, I intend to step forward publicly and claim you as my mate before the ritual can be completed." Elena's breath caught. In front of the entire pack? In front of the Blackthorn representatives themselves? "Yes," Damon said, his expression steady, despite the enormity of what he proposed. "It is the only way to prove the bond is genuine, rather than a political maneuver. A king who breaks tradition openly, in full view of witnesses, cannot easily be accused of hiding behind privilege. And if it fails? If the council refuses to recognize the claim, or if Blackthorn retaliates for the broken alliance? Then we will face those consequences together, Damon said quietly. But Elena, I need to know first, before I risk everything on that moment, whether you would accept the claim if I made it. I will not force this upon you regardless of what instinct tells either of us. You deserve the chance to choose freely, even now. Elena sat in silence for a long moment, staring into the fire, weighing years of guarded independence against the undeniable pull she had felt since the moment she first caught his scent by the river. She thought of Peter's kind but hollow offer, of the widower and the hunter who had proposed practical arrangements devoid of any real feeling, of the terrifying prospect of being bound permanently to a stranger from Blackthorn territory simply because she had refused to compromise. And then she thought of the way her heart had raced, standing across from Damon in the clearing, the way something in her had recognized him instantly, despite never having spoken to him before that night. I don't know you, she finally said. Not really. 10 years of silence doesn't disappear just because instinct says we belong together. I know, Damon said. I am not asking you to trust me completely tonight. I am asking only for the chance to prove myself worthy of that trust, starting with honesty rather than silence, which is more than I offered for the last decade. Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for any trace of the calculated political maneuvering the council so often accused him of. She found instead something rawer, something that looked almost like fear beneath the composed exterior of a king who had spent years hiding behind duty rather than admitting vulnerability. If you do this, she said slowly, if you claim me in front of the entire pack, there will be no taking it back. The council will see it as a challenge to their authority. Blackthorn will see it as an insult they cannot ignore. You would be risking everything, your rule, the peace along the border, all of it, for someone you barely know. I have spent 10 years telling myself that duty required me to stand alone, Damon said. Watching you nearly be handed to Blackthorn against your will made me realize how wrong that belief truly was. I would rather risk everything I have built than watch you become a political trade, because I was too afraid to claim what I already knew to be true. The fire crackled between them, and Elena felt something inside her chest loosen slightly, some guarded piece of herself she had kept locked away since her broken engagement 2 years earlier. She did not fully trust him yet, not completely, but she recognized in his words something she had not expected to find, a willingness to risk everything, not for political gain, but for her. 5 days, she said finally. 5 days until the assembly. If you truly intend to do this, I want time before then. Time to understand who you are beyond the title, beyond the decree, beyond instinct alone. If the bond is real, it should survive that. Damon's expression shifted, something like relief and hope passing across his features simultaneously. 5 days, he agreed. I will not waste a single one of them. Elena left the great house that evening, with her mind still spinning, though the chaos felt different now, less like panic and more like the uncertain beginning of something she had not allowed herself to consider possible. She did not know yet whether the coming days would confirm the bond Damon believed in so completely, or whether the risks he intended to take on the day of the assembly would shatter everything before it truly had the chance to begin. But walking home beneath a sky full of stars, she found herself, for the first time since the horn sounded 3 times across the valley, feeling something other than dread about the future rapidly approaching. The 5 days that followed unfolded differently than Elena had imagined they would. Damon kept his promise not to waste them, though he approached their time together with a restraint that surprised her, never pushing beyond what she seemed ready to offer, never assuming familiarity she had not yet granted him. He met her each morning near the river where their scents had first crossed weeks earlier, and together they walked the borders of the territory he ruled, talking not about politics or decrees, but about smaller things, the kind of ordinary conversations Elena had never imagined sharing with a king. On the first morning, he told her about his father, about the border skirmish that had taken his life and forced Damon into leadership, far younger than he had ever expected. He spoke of the weight of sudden responsibility, of nights spent awake calculating decisions that affected hundreds of lives, of the loneliness that came with a position where trust had to be earned carefully and given sparingly. Elena found herself, in turn, speaking more openly than she had in years about her broken engagement, about the humiliation of standing alone at what should have been a joining ceremony, about the promise she had made to herself afterward, never again to let anyone else control her heart. Damon listened without judgment, without the pity she had grown so weary of receiving from others in the pack, and something about his quiet attentiveness made the old wound feel, for the first time, slightly less raw. On the second day, they crossed paths with a group of pups playing near the eastern fields, and Elena watched, surprised, as Damon knelt to speak with them, asking about their games, admiring a crude wooden toy one child proudly displayed. It was such a small moment, unremarkable in most ways, yet it revealed something about him that the formal, guarded king she had witnessed at the assembly weeks earlier had never shown. "You're different than I expected," she admitted, as they continued walking afterward. "Different how?" "Softer," she said. "I expected someone colder, someone who saw the pack only as territory to manage, rather than people to care for." Damon's expression grew thoughtful. "I learned early that showing softness publicly invited challenges to my authority. Rivals look for weakness, and grief, tenderness, uncertainty, all of it, can be mistaken for weakness, if displayed carelessly. So I learned to keep it hidden, even from those closest to me. And now? Now I am tired of hiding," he said simply, and the honesty in his voice settled something uncertain in Elena's chest. On the third day, tension crept back into their conversations, as news arrived that Blackthorn representatives had grown increasingly impatient, pressing the council for confirmation that the match would proceed as planned, regardless of Elena's personal preference. Elena felt the familiar dread returning, the countdown pressing closer with each passing hour, and Damon, sensing her unease, reached for her hand for the first time since their conversation began, a small gesture that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through her entire body. "2 days," he said quietly. "Whatever happens at the assembly, know that I intend to keep my word. And if the council refuses to accept the claim, if they side with Blackthorn regardless of what you declare, then we will face that battle when it comes," Damon said. "But I would rather fight for you openly than lose you through silence, exactly as I nearly did for the last 10 years. On the 4th day, Elena finally allowed herself to admit, quietly and only to herself, that whatever she felt toward Damon had grown into something far more complicated than simple curiosity or reluctant duty. The pull she had sensed from their very first meeting in the clearing had deepened into something steadier, something that felt less like fated instinct and more like genuine understanding, built through honest conversation and shared vulnerability. She still carried caution, still remembered the years of silence he had kept before finding the courage to seek her out, but the anger she had first felt toward him had softened considerably, replaced by something warmer and far more uncertain. That evening, as they sat together near the river where everything had first begun, Damon turned to her with an expression more serious than she had seen from him since their initial encounter in the clearing. "Tomorrow is the assembly," he said. "I need to ask you something honestly, and I need an honest answer in return." "Ask," Elena said. "If I step forward tomorrow and claim you before the entire pack, before the Blackthorn representatives, before the council itself, will you accept the claim? Or will these 5 days have changed nothing?" Elena studied him for a long moment, the fading sunlight catching the uncertainty in his eyes, uncertainty she had not expected from a man who ruled an entire territory with unshakable authority. She thought of everything the past 5 days had revealed, the loneliness beneath his composed exterior, the gentleness he kept hidden from most of the pack, the honesty he had offered her without hesitation once he allowed himself to be truly seen. "These 5 days have changed everything," she said quietly. "I still don't know exactly what tomorrow will bring. I don't know how the council will react, or whether Blackthorn will accept defeat gracefully. But I know that whatever risk you're taking, I no longer want to face the alternative. I don't want to be handed to a stranger while the one person who might actually understand me stands silent because he feared the consequences." Relief passed visibly across Damon's features, followed quickly by something more intense, something that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. "Then tomorrow, in front of everyone, I intend to do what I should have done 10 years ago." They sat together as darkness fell fully around them, neither speaking further, though the silence between them now carried none of the tension it once had. Elena felt, for the first time since the horn sounded 3 times across the valley weeks earlier, something close to peace, fragile but real, settling over the uncertain future rapidly approaching. Yet even as that fragile peace took hold, danger gathered unseen at the edges of their world. That same evening, in a shadowed clearing near the northern border, Victor Kane of the Blackthorn Pack met privately with two of his most trusted enforcers, his expression cold and calculating as he listened to reports of the Alpha King's unusual behavior over the preceding days. "He has been seen with the girl," one enforcer reported. "Walking the borders together, speaking privately. The rumors suggest he intends to break the arranged match before the assembly even begins." Victor's jaw tightened, ambition and wounded pride sharpening his already dangerous temper. "Ashford believes he can insult my pack publicly and suffer no consequence? What are your orders?" Victor was silent for a long moment, considering the possibilities before him, with the patient calculation of a wolf who had clawed his way to power through cunning rather than brute strength alone. "Attend the assembly as planned," he finally said. "If Ashford intends to humiliate us before the entire territory, then we will ensure the cost of that humiliation follows him far beyond a single evening." The enforcers nodded and departed into the darkness, leaving Victor alone, with thoughts that promised nothing good for the fragile peace Elena and Damon had begun to build over the preceding days. Neither of them yet understood the storm quietly gathering against them, a storm that would arrive at the very moment they intended to claim their future together, in front of the entire watching pack. The morning of the assembly arrived cold and clear, the kind of bright autumn day that seemed almost mockingly peaceful, given the tension gripping the entire settlement. Elena rose before dawn, unable to sleep any longer, and dressed slowly in the simple gray tunic she had chosen the night before, refusing the elaborate ceremonial garments some of her neighbors had suggested. Whatever happened today, she intended to face it as herself, not as some polished version dressed up for a ritual she had never wanted in the first place. By mid-morning, the entire pack had gathered in and around the great stone hall, far more crowded than the assembly weeks earlier when the decree had first been announced. Word had spread that today would bring the final matches, and curiosity mixed with anxiety hung thick in the air as wolves pressed together, craning for a view of the raised platform where the Elder Council would soon take their seats. Elena found a place near the front, her heart pounding steadily against her ribs, scanning the platform for any sign of Damon. She spotted Gareth first, standing near the edge of the stage with an expression carefully guarded, and beside him, unmistakable even from a distance, the Alpha King himself, dressed in dark formal clothing that somehow made him look both more regal and more tense than she had ever seen him. Across the hall, near the entrance reserved for visiting dignitaries, Elena caught sight of a group she did not recognize, their bearing proud and cold, marked unmistakably as Blackthorn representatives. At their center stood a tall, broad-shouldered man, with sharp eyes that swept the crowd with obvious calculation. Elena did not need to be told his identity. Victor Kane had come personally to witness the match he clearly expected to claim. Edgar Thorne stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice carrying the same authority it had weeks earlier, though something in his expression today seemed more guarded, more watchful. "Wolves of Ashford," he began, "today concludes the 30 days granted by council decree. All matches previously declared have been recorded. Those who remain unmatched will now be joined according to council determination, for the strength and security of our territory." Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides, as Edgar began reading through the list of remaining unmatched wolves, pairing names one by one. Some met with visible relief, others with quiet resignation. She barely heard most of the announcements, her attention fixed entirely on Damon, who stood motionless at the edge of the platform, his eyes finding hers across the crowded hall, and holding steady, a silent promise passing between them, despite the distance separating them. Finally, Edgar reached the name Elena had been dreading since her aunt first warned her weeks earlier. "Elena Voss," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall, "shall be joined to Representative Marcus Kane, of the Blackthorn Pack, securing peace and alliance along our contested northern border." A murmur rippled through the crowd as the Blackthorn representative, a younger relative of Victor's standing near the entrance, stepped forward with obvious satisfaction, moving toward the platform where the binding ritual would take place. Elena felt her heart slam against her ribs, panic and anger warring inside her chest, as the moment she had feared for weeks arrived exactly as predicted. She had barely taken a step forward to voice her refusal when a voice cut across the hall, sharp and commanding, silencing every murmur instantly. "Stop." Every head turned toward the platform, where Damon Ashford had stepped forward, his expression fierce and unwavering, addressing not just Edgar and the council, but the entire assembled pack, and the watching Blackthorn delegation as well. "This match will not proceed," Damon continued, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the packed hall. "Elena Voss will not be bound to Blackthorn territory today, or any day, against her will." Edgar's face flushed with immediate anger. "Alpha Ashford, this match has been approved by full council authority, negotiated in good faith with our neighbors. You cannot simply—" "I can," Damon interrupted, moving down from the platform directly toward Elena, the crowd parting instinctively before him, a stunned silence falling over the entire hall as everyone present realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Because Elena Voss is my fated mate, and I claim her here, before all of you, as is my right, under the oldest laws of our kind, laws that predate any decree the council has issued." Gasps and murmurs erupted through the crowd, disbelief and shock rippling outward in waves. Elena felt every eye in the hall shift toward her, the weight of hundreds of stares pressing down on her, as Damon closed the final distance between them, stopping directly before her, his eyes searching hers for confirmation of everything he had just declared publicly. "Elena," he said quietly, though the hall had grown so silent his voice still carried to every corner. "I am asking you now, in front of everyone, exactly as I promised, will you accept this claim?" Elena's heart pounded so violently she could barely breathe, every instinct in her body screaming at the enormity of the moment, the impossibility of what was happening, and yet beneath the panic, a quiet certainty settled over her, steady and undeniable. She thought of the 5 days they had shared, the honesty he had offered, the gentleness she had witnessed beneath his guarded exterior, the pull she could no longer deny had existed between them, from the very first moment their scents had crossed by the river. "Yes," she said, her voice clear despite the trembling in her hands. "I accept." The hall erupted into chaos immediately, some wolves cheering in stunned delight, others shouting objections, the Blackthorn delegation moving forward with visible fury, as Victor Kane pushed through the crowd toward the platform, his expression thunderous. "This is an insult," Victor roared, his voice cutting through the noise. "You dishonor an agreement negotiated in good faith, Ashford. You humiliate my pack before the entire territory." "I broke no agreement I ever made," Damon replied, standing firm despite the fury radiating from the Blackthorn Alpha. "The council negotiated on Elena's behalf without her consent, a decision she never agreed to and never would have. I will not allow her to be traded like territory for the sake of political convenience." Victor's eyes blazed with barely restrained rage as he looked between Damon and Elena, then back toward Edgar and the rest of the stunned council. "You will regret this decision, Ashford. This border was never as secure as your council believed, and now you have given us every reason to test that weakness directly." With that, Victor turned sharply and stormed from the hall, his delegation following close behind, leaving behind a stunned silence that gradually gave way to a rising tide of frantic whispers throughout the crowd. Edgar remained on the platform, his face pale with fury and disbelief, staring down at Damon and Elena as though trying to calculate the full extent of the damage that had just been done. "You have jeopardized everything," Edgar said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "The border peace, the council's authority, the safety of this entire pack, all sacrificed for a personal whim." "Not a whim," Damon said, turning to face the council directly, one hand finding Elena's and holding it firmly, despite the chaos surrounding them. "A truth I should have claimed 10 years ago. If the council wishes to challenge my authority over this decision, I welcome that challenge openly, exactly as I have claimed this bond openly, before every witness in this hall." Edgar said nothing further, though his expression promised the conflict was far from finished. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, still buzzing with shock and speculation, Elena stood beside Damon, amid the wreckage of the council's carefully constructed plans, uncertain whether she had just witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary or the first spark of a conflict that would consume everything both of them had ever known. Whatever came next, there was no undoing what had just happened. The Alpha King had done the unthinkable, defying decree and delegation alike before the entire watching pack, and the consequences of that defiance were only just beginning to unfold. The days following the assembly brought attention to the settlement, unlike anything Elena had experienced before. Word of Damon's public claim spread through every corner of the territory within hours, and opinions split sharply among the pack. Some wolves celebrated the moment as proof that even their king could not escape the power of a true bond, whispering romantically about fate finally catching up with a man who had denied it for a decade. Others, particularly those closest to the Elder Council, viewed the act as reckless and dangerous, a personal choice made at the expense of the entire pack's safety. Elena felt the weight of both reactions everywhere she went. Neighbors who had barely spoken to her before now greeted her warmly, curious and delighted by the unexpected romance unfolding before them. Others regarded her with suspicion, as though she alone bore responsibility for the fractured peace along the northern border, though she had never asked for any of what had happened. On the second day after the assembly, Marla arrived at Elena's cabin with an expression more troubled than Elena had ever seen from her aunt. "The council convened an emergency session this morning," Marla said, settling heavily into the chair across from Elena's table. "Edgar is pushing for a formal challenge against Damon's authority. He argues that claiming a mate through ancient right does not exempt him from council decree, and that his actions have endangered the entire pack by provoking Blackthorn unnecessarily." Elena's stomach tightened. Will the challenge succeed? "I don't know," Marla admitted. "The old laws are clear that fated bonds supersede council decree, but Edgar argues Damon manipulated the timing to avoid accountability, rather than acting purely from instinct. If enough council members side with him, they could call for a formal vote of no confidence. And if that happens, Marla's expression grew grim, then Damon's rule could be challenged openly, possibly even contested by force if a rival within the pack sees opportunity in the chaos. Elena sat in stunned silence, absorbing the full weight of what her aunt had just described. She had known, distantly, that Damon's public claim carried political risk, but she had not fully understood, until now, how quickly that risk might spiral into something far more dangerous, threatening not just his position, but the stability of the entire territory. That evening, she made her way to the great house, finding Damon in his study once again, though this time the atmosphere felt heavier, more strained than during their earlier conversations. Gareth stood near the door, his expression grim, and papers covered the desk between them, records and reports Elena did not fully understand but recognized immediately, as evidence of a crisis unfolding rapidly. "Marla told me about the council challenge," Elena said, closing the door behind her. Damon looked up, exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes despite his attempt to appear composed. "Edgar has gathered enough support to force a formal vote within the week. If he succeeds, my authority over the pack could be suspended pending review." "This is my fault," Elena said quietly. "If I had simply accepted the lottery match, or chosen someone safer, none of this would be happening." "Do not say that," Damon replied, his voice sharp with an intensity that startled her. "You are not responsible for a decree you never wanted, or for a council too rigid to recognize a genuine bond when they see one. If anyone bears responsibility, it is me, for waiting 10 years to claim what I already knew was true, allowing the situation to reach a crisis point before I finally acted." Gareth cleared his throat carefully. "There is more you should know, Elena. Since the assembly, Blackthorn scouts have been spotted along the northern border with increasing frequency. Victor Kane has not made any direct move yet, but our patrols report unusual activity, testing our defenses in ways that suggest preparation rather than mere posturing." Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the fire crackling nearby. "He means to retaliate." "Possibly," Damon said. "Victor has wanted a foothold along this border for years. The broken match gives him justification he did not have before, both to his own pack and to any allies he might seek to draw into a larger conflict." "So your claim has not only jeopardized your position within the pack," Elena said slowly. "It may have started something far more dangerous with Blackthorn itself." Damon did not deny it, his silence confirming what Elena had already begun to fear. She sank into the chair across from him, her mind racing through the tangled consequences of a single moment in the crowded hall days earlier, a moment that had felt, at the time, like the bravest and most honest thing either of them had ever done. "I don't regret choosing you," she said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "Whatever comes next, I want you to know that." Something in Damon's expression softened, though the exhaustion and worry remained clearly visible beneath it. "Nor do I regret claiming you, Elena. Not for a moment, regardless of what challenges lie ahead. But I owe you the truth of exactly how difficult those challenges may become." Over the following days, the situation continued to deteriorate. Edgar's push for a formal council challenge gained momentum, drawing support from members who had long resented the Alpha King's independence from their authority. Rumors began circulating that certain wolves within the pack, dissatisfied with Damon's leadership for reasons that predated the current crisis entirely, saw the turmoil as an opportunity to press their own grievances, further destabilizing an already fractured pack. Meanwhile, reports from the northern border grew increasingly concerning. Patrol wolves returned, with stories of Blackthorn scouts moving in coordinated patterns along contested territory lines, testing boundaries in ways that suggested careful planning rather than random provocation. Gareth doubled the border patrols, though Damon remained cautious about escalating tensions further, while the council challenge loomed unresolved. Elena found herself caught in the middle of both crises, watching helplessly as the world around her grew more chaotic with each passing day. She spent her time between the Great House, where she tried to offer whatever support she could to Damon as he navigated the mounting political pressure, and her own cabin, where the whispers and speculation of her neighbors followed her everywhere she went. On the 5th day after the assembly, a messenger arrived at the Great House bearing grim news that shattered whatever fragile stability remained. A border patrol near the northern edge of the territory had encountered Blackthorn scouts in what quickly escalated into open confrontation. No lives had been lost, but injuries had been sustained on both sides, and the incident marked the first direct clash between the two packs since the broken match at the assembly. Damon received the news with a controlled fury that Elena had not witnessed from him before, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly, his knuckles turned white. "This is exactly what Edgar warned would happen," he said quietly, "and exactly what Victor Kane intended, provoking conflict he can later claim was justified by my actions at the assembly." "What happens now?" Elena asked, fear tightening in her chest at the implications of open conflict between the two packs. "Now," Damon said grimly, "I face the council challenge and the threat from Blackthorn simultaneously, with far less unity behind me than I need to survive either crisis alone." The weight of everything pressing down around them felt suddenly, overwhelmingly heavy, and Elena realized, watching Damon grapple with the mounting consequences of the choice they had made together, that the true test of their bond had only just begun. The council convened 3 days later for the formal challenge Edgar had spent the preceding week organizing. Elena stood at the back of the Great Hall alongside Marla, watching as the full Elder Council took their seats along the raised platform, their expressions ranging from grim determination to visible discomfort with the proceedings about to unfold. Damon stood before them, flanked by Gareth, his posture straight and unyielding despite the exhaustion Elena knew he had been carrying since the border clash days earlier. Edgar rose first to present the formal challenge, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had spent decades navigating pack politics. "Alpha Ashford's decision to publicly claim a mate in defiance of established decree has resulted in direct consequence to this pack's safety," he began. "Border conflict with Blackthorn territory, previously non-existent for years under careful negotiation, has now erupted within days of his impulsive declaration. I ask this council to consider whether such judgment reflects the leadership this pack requires." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, and Elena felt her chest tighten with anxiety as she watched the council members exchange glances, some clearly sympathetic to Edgar's argument, others less convinced. A younger council member, a woman named Fiona Reyes who had said little during previous sessions, finally spoke. "Councilman Thorne raises legitimate concerns," Fiona said carefully, "but I would remind this assembly that the ancient laws governing fated bonds have existed longer than any council decree. Alpha Ashford claimed his right under those laws, publicly and honestly, before the entire pack as witness. That is not the behavior of a king hiding behind privilege. That is transparency this council should respect, even if the timing proved politically inconvenient." Edgar's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Damon stepped forward, his voice calm, despite the tension radiating through the hall. I do not deny that my claim has created difficulty with Blackthorn territory, but I would ask this council to consider an important truth. Victor Kane sought this border conflict long before the assembly ever took place. Reports from our patrols indicate increased Blackthorn activity along contested lines for weeks prior to my public claim, evidence that Victor was already preparing for confrontation regardless of how the match unfolded. Gareth stepped forward at Damon's signal, presenting a series of reports documenting patrol sightings that predated the assembly by nearly 2 weeks, evidence that Blackthorn scouts had been testing Ashford defenses long before Elena's name was ever called during the ceremony. A murmur of surprise passed through the council members as they reviewed the documentation, several exchanging uncertain glances. If Victor Kane sought conflict regardless of the outcome, Damon continued, then the true failure was not my claim, but this pack's willingness to trade a woman's future for a peace that was never as secure as this council believed. I would rather face open conflict honestly than continue pretending a fragile alliance built on forced matches could ever have held indefinitely. Elena watched, her heart pounding, as the council members deliberated quietly among themselves, the outcome of the challenge hanging uncertainly in the balance. Edgar remained visibly unconvinced, his jaw tight with frustration, but several other members seemed to be reconsidering their positions in light of the evidence presented. Finally, the eldest council member beside Edgar, a frail but sharp-eyed woman named Councilwoman Doris Hale, rose slowly to speak. This council was formed to protect the strength and future of our pack, she said, her voice quavering slightly with age but carrying clear authority nonetheless. We enacted the decree believing forced matches would secure that future. Perhaps we were wrong to believe unity could be built through compulsion, rather than genuine bond. I move that the challenge against Alpha Ashford's authority be dismissed, and that this council instead turn its full attention toward addressing the very real threat gathering along our northern border. A tense silence followed her words, before several other council members voiced their agreement, one by one, until it became clear that Edgar's challenge lacked sufficient support to proceed. Edgar's face flushed with anger and humiliation, but he said nothing further, sitting back down as the formal challenge was officially dismissed by council vote. Elena felt relief flood through her, though she knew immediately that the larger crisis remained unresolved. The council's attention now shifted fully toward the growing threat from Blackthorn, and as the session continued, reports arrived detailing increasingly aggressive movements along the border, further clashes between patrol wolves, and unconfirmed rumors that Victor Kane had begun reaching out to other territories, seeking allies for what appeared to be a coordinated campaign against Ashford lands. After the session concluded, Elena found Damon alone near the edge of the hall, his relief at surviving the council challenge tempered heavily by the darker news that had followed. You survived Edgar's challenge, she said quietly, moving to stand beside him. For now, Damon replied. But Victor Kane grows bolder by the day, and if he succeeds in drawing other territories into his campaign against us, this conflict could become something far larger than a border dispute. What can we do? Damon turned to face her fully, something resolute settling into his expression, despite the weariness still visible beneath it. We prepare. We strengthen our defenses, reinforce our alliances with neighboring territories who remain loyal, and we face whatever Victor intends to bring against us together, rather than allowing fear or division to weaken us from within, exactly as he hopes it will. Elena nodded, though the weight of everything unfolding around them settled heavily in her chest. The bond she had chosen to accept before the entire pack had survived its first true test, the council's challenge to Damon's authority, but a far greater threat now loomed on the horizon, one that would demand more from both of them than either had yet been asked to give. As they stood together in the quiet aftermath of the hearing, watching the last of the council members file out of the hall, Elena understood with growing certainty that the true trial of their bond was only beginning, and that whatever came next would test not just their commitment to each other, but the strength and unity of the entire pack they had both sworn, in their own ways, to protect. 2 weeks passed following the dismissal of Edgar's challenge, and though the immediate political crisis had eased, the threat from Blackthorn territory only continued to grow. Gareth's patrols reported near daily encounters along the contested border, small skirmishes that stopped short of full engagement, but left both sides increasingly wary and exhausted. Damon spent long hours each day coordinating defenses, meeting with loyal allies from neighboring territories, and preparing the pack for the possibility that Victor Kane's ambitions might soon escalate beyond scattered border testing into something far more serious. Elena, determined not to remain a passive bystander while the pack she now belonged to faced growing danger, threw herself into whatever tasks she could contribute. She spent her mornings helping coordinate supplies for the reinforced border patrols, and her afternoons working alongside the pack healers, learning to prepare remedies for the injuries that had become increasingly common since the skirmishes began. The work exhausted her, but it also gave her purpose, a way to feel useful rather than helpless, as the conflict continued to unfold around her. The bond between her and Damon deepened steadily during this period, forged not through grand gestures but through the quiet accumulation of shared struggle. They ate meals together when his schedule allowed, discussed strategy long into the evening, and found comfort in each other's presence, even when neither had the energy for lengthy conversation. Elena began to understand, more fully with each passing day, the true weight Damon carried as king, a burden she had only glimpsed during their early conversations by the river, but now witnessed firsthand, in the exhausted lines, etched permanently into his face. On a cold morning 3 weeks after the council hearing, disaster finally arrived. A messenger burst into the great house before dawn, breathless and injured, reporting that a large Blackthorn force had crossed the northern border overnight, moving swiftly toward one of the outlying Ashford settlements before patrol wolves could raise a proper alarm. Damon was moving before the messenger finished speaking, calling for Gareth and assembling every available fighter within minutes. Elena, refusing to be left behind despite Damon's initial protest, insisted on joining the response, arguing that her knowledge of healing remedies would prove essential once the fighting inevitably produced casualties. Damon relented only after making her promise to remain well behind the front lines, a promise she intended to keep for exactly as long as circumstances allowed. The journey to the threatened settlement passed in a blur of urgency. Wolves running at full speed through familiar forest paths, transformed suddenly unfamiliar by the desperate pace of their advance. They arrived to find the settlement already under attack, Blackthorn wolves moving aggressively through the outer perimeter, while Ashford defenders fought desperately to hold their ground against a force that outnumbered them significantly. Damon shifted immediately into his wolf form, a massive dark gray shape that moved with terrifying speed and precision into the heart of the conflict, rallying scattered defenders and driving back the initial wave of attackers through sheer force of will and skill. Elena watched from a safer distance, her heart in her throat, as he fought alongside his pack with a ferocity she had not fully witnessed before, every movement calculated and controlled despite the chaos surrounding him. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though it likely lasted only a fraction of that time, and Elena found herself pulled steadily closer to the fighting, as wounded wolves began retreating toward her position, desperate for the remedies she had spent the past weeks learning to prepare. She worked quickly, tending to injuries as best she could, her hands steady, despite the fear coursing through her at the sounds of continued fighting nearby. It was during this chaos that she caught sight of Victor Kane himself, moving through the battle, toward the position where Damon fought, clearly seeking a direct confrontation with the king, who had humiliated him publicly weeks earlier. Elena's heart seized with terror as she watched Victor close the distance, his intentions unmistakable even from where she stood. Without fully thinking through the danger, Elena moved closer, shouting a warning that cut through the noise of battle, just as Victor lunged toward Damon's exposed flank. The warning gave Damon just enough time to turn, meeting Victor's attack head-on rather than being caught unprepared, the two alphas locking together in a fierce exchange that drew the attention of every wolf still fighting nearby. The confrontation between them was brutal but relatively brief, Damon's superior training and the desperate strength born of protecting everything he had recently claimed, proving decisive against Victor's calculated aggression. When it ended, Victor lay defeated, but alive, forced finally to acknowledge that his campaign against Ashford territory had failed to achieve the decisive victory he had sought. In the aftermath, as Blackthorn forces began retreating from the settlement under the weight of their alpha's defeat, Damon shifted back into human form, moving immediately toward where Elena stood, relief and something fierce and protective visible in his eyes as he closed the distance between them. "You should not have been so close," he said, though the words carried more concern than reprimand. If I had not warned you, Victor might have caught you unprepared, Elena replied, her own relief at his safety, mixing with lingering fear from what she had just witnessed. Damon pulled her close, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply holding on to each other amid the wreckage of the battle, grateful beyond words that both had survived a confrontation that could easily have ended far differently. Around them, the settlement slowly began the process of counting losses and tending to the wounded. The immediate crisis passed, though the larger consequences of the conflict remained still to be determined. "This is not over," Damon said finally, his voice grim, despite the relief evident in his expression. "Victor's defeat here does not guarantee he will abandon his ambitions entirely, but it proves something important, both to him and to every wolf who doubted whether our bond could withstand genuine crisis." Elena looked up at him, exhaustion and lingering fear giving way slowly to something steadier, a certainty that had grown throughout the harrowing hours of battle into something unshakable. "We faced it together," she said. "Whatever comes next, I believe we can face that together too." As the sun began setting over the battle-scarred settlement, casting long shadows across ground where Ashford and Blackthorn wolves had fought only hours earlier, Elena understood with complete clarity that the bond she had once questioned, once approached with caution and guarded uncertainty, had been tested in the most severe way imaginable, and had emerged not weakened, but stronger than either of them could have anticipated when this entire journey began weeks earlier, with a single horn sounding 3 times across the valley. In the weeks that followed the battle at the outlying settlement, word of Victor Kane's defeat spread quickly through every territory bordering Ashford lands. Blackthorn's aggressive campaign collapsed almost entirely in the aftermath, its own council reportedly moving to restrain Victor's ambitions, after the costly and unsuccessful confrontation had drained resources and support he could not easily replace. Reports from the northern border grew steadily quieter, patrol wolves returning day after day, with news of undisturbed peace rather than fresh conflict, and slowly, cautiously, the entire pack began to breathe easier, for the first time in nearly 2 months. Elena spent those recovering weeks dividing her time between the healers, continuing to tend wounds that had not yet fully closed, and the great house, where Damon worked steadily to repair the political fractures the crisis had exposed within the pack's leadership. Edgar Thorne, humbled considerably by the outcome of events he had once argued so forcefully against, approached Damon privately to acknowledge, if not fully apologize for, the misjudgment behind his earlier challenge. Damon accepted the gesture with more grace than Elena might have expected, recognizing perhaps that unity mattered more now than lingering resentment over decisions already resolved by events far beyond anyone's full control. On a clear afternoon nearly a month after the battle, the Elder Council called for a formal assembly, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the anxious dread that had hung over the previous gatherings. Wolves filled the great hall once more, but their expressions reflected curiosity and cautious hope rather than fear, sensing correctly that today's announcement would differ significantly from the decree that had upended their lives 2 months earlier. Damon stood at the center of the platform, Elena beside him, as Edgar rose to address the crowd, his voice carrying a humility that had not been present during his earlier proclamations. 2 months ago, Edgar began, this council issued a decree born from fear, believing forced unity could secure our pack's future. Recent events have taught us a harder truth. Genuine strength comes not from compulsion, but from bonds freely chosen and fiercely defended. This council formally rescinds the choosing decree, effective immediately. A wave of relief and quiet celebration swept through the gathered crowd. Wolves who had spent weeks anxiously navigating forced arrangements, suddenly released from an obligation that had never truly served the pack's well-being in the first place. Elena watched the reaction ripple outward, remembering her own panic when the decree had first been announced, and felt a deep satisfaction knowing that no other wolf would face the same impossible pressure she had endured. Damon stepped forward once the crowd's reaction settled, his voice steady and clear as he addressed the pack directly. I have learned, through difficult and costly experience, that leadership built on fear of vulnerability ultimately weakens rather than strengthens what we are trying to protect. I claimed Elena Voss as my mate, not because ancient law demanded it, but because I finally allowed myself, after 10 years of denial, to choose honestly what my heart had already known. I ask this pack to remember that lesson going forward. Choose your bonds freely. Build your futures on trust rather than compulsion. That is how we truly secure the strength of this territory, now and for generations to come. The hall erupted into genuine applause, a stark contrast to the tense, fearful silence that had greeted the original decree 2 months earlier. Elena felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the panic of that first horn blast, to the quiet certainty she now felt standing beside the man she had once feared she would never trust. After the assembly concluded, Elena and Damon walked together toward the river, where their bond had first begun weeks earlier. The same path she had once walked alone, uncertain, and afraid of a future she felt powerless to control. The forest around them had begun shifting toward the golden colors of autumn, sunlight filtering warmly through branches overhead, as they made their way to the familiar clearing, where Damon had first revealed the truth he had carried silently for a decade. "Any regrets?" Damon asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them as they reached the water's edge. Elena considered the question seriously, thinking back over everything the past 2 months had brought. The fear, the uncertainty, the danger, but also the honesty, the growing trust, the fierce protectiveness she had witnessed and come to rely upon in equal measure. "None," she said finally. "I spent 2 years after my broken engagement, convinced I would never trust anyone with my heart again. I never expected that trust to be rebuilt through a decree I hated, forced into existence by a council, trying to control something that should have always been a choice." "For what it's worth," Damon said, reaching for her hand, "I am grateful, despite everything it cost us, that the decree existed at all. Without it, I fear I might have continued hiding behind duty for another 10 years, too afraid to claim what I already knew to be true." Elena smiled, something warm and settled replacing the anxiety that had defined so much of the preceding weeks. Then perhaps some good came from the council's decree after all, even if none of us realized it at the time. They stood together at the river's edge as the afternoon light deepened toward evening, two people who had begun this journey as strangers, forced together by circumstance and fear, and who now stood as something far stronger, bound not by decree or lottery or political necessity, but by a choice made freely, tested severely, and proven unbreakable through every trial the past 2 months had thrown against it. Behind them, across the valley, the pack they both loved continued rebuilding, after weeks of turmoil, stronger now, for having weathered the storm together, rather than fracturing under the weight of fear and forced compulsion. The horn that had once sounded 3 times across the valley, heralding a decree that threatened to control the hearts of an entire territory, had ultimately led not to the loss of freedom it once promised, but to a reminder that the strongest bonds were always the ones chosen freely, defended fiercely, and built, patiently and honestly, one difficult day at a time. And as the sun set gently over Ashford territory that evening, casting the valley in warm golden light, Elena Voss stood beside her king, no longer afraid of the future, ready at last to build it together, exactly as she had chosen, exactly as fate had always intended.